I've attended hybrid meetings or meetings in physical presence in the last couple of weeks, and I tell you, this makes a big difference. And I'm glad that we can have a hybrid event today, so I greet all our listeners. I'm glad that they are there. I think 5 years ago, 2016, September, was 1 year after the Paris Accord of 2015 on climate change. And this was obviously a watershed moment. Last year, there was another watershed moment, and that was the pandemic. Now, you might say, what's the link between the Luxembourg Green Exchange and the pandemic? A very important one. Because when the whole planet, or nearly all economies, had to lock down back in the second quarter of last year, what did we see? Well, we saw that the economies were not growing anymore, and everybody was very unhappy about it. There was only one thing that was happy, that was the planet. The air was better, the rivers were cleaner, the sea was cleaner, the fish were happier. Now you might say, well, if you were convinced before the pandemic that climate change is an issue, you are not surprised about what I say. But if you were a climate skeptical person, and I tell you there are still many around, you got a proof that it's human activity that is responsible for climate change. And it's not a normal, natural event or evolution that the temperature grows. So the pandemic has been a watershed moment. It has really been a catalyzer and a revealer of the fact that we need to act, that finance also needs to act. And that's why the moment that was chosen in 2016 to launch the Luxembourg Green Exchange was ideal. Now, the second thing I would like to dwell on is that the area in the world that is most active on climate change, and I think nobody will doubt that, is Europe. And Europe has had a solidarity response in the wake of the pandemic on the one hand, and has shown solidarity. How many commentators remember in April of last year said, Europe again is going to fail. It's not going to show solidarity, it's not going to act together. We proved the contrary. We managed to trigger solidarity, and we also managed to launch a recovery together. And what are the two priorities of the new Green Deal? Digitalization and climate change. Now, the Commission in the national programs of the Recovery Fund for all countries has set the bar rather high, saying that you needed to have 32% of your investments in climate change and 20% in digitalization. All countries had to commit to that and reached it. Luxembourg itself overcame those objectives because we have 60% on climate change investment and 30% roughly on digitalization. Basically, all our recovery plan meets those two objectives. So Europe is here at the heart of the solution. And I think we can be proud of that. That has helped, I'm sure, the Luxembourg Green Exchange to be a success story. And then what the Commission has done, it has launched a social bond, it has launched green bonds at the Luxembourg Exchange to finance part of these programs. Because, and that was, I think, a Hamiltonian moment is what's called, because the Commission got the authorization to lend on behalf of the member states. This was not foreseen anywhere. And no country would ever have accepted that had we not been in the special situation of the pandemic. So you see, the pandemic has been a watershed moment. And the result is there, the numbers are there. We have a forecast of 850 billion euro of sustainable bonds for 2021, an absolute record and plus 60% compared to the year before. We have reached $2 trillion assets in sustainable assets, another milestone. And 50% of total inflows in European investment funds are sustainable ones. So €1 out of 2 that has flown into the investment fund industry this year is already sustainable. So you see the progression is spectacular. I remember my speeches 2-3 years ago. I used to say, well, green bonds is very important and is growing. And then I always had to add, but let's be realistic. Today, green bonds represent only 2% of all world emissions. Now, as we speak, the number is 8%. Still far too low, but 4 times higher than it was a couple of years ago. So the numbers tell us another story. They tell us that the area in the world where green bonds and sustainable bonds or assets in funds where are most thriving is Europe. And it also means that the leading currency for these products is the euro. So here is one area where Europe is a leader. I wish that in digitalization it was the same. I wish that in artificial intelligence it were the same. But in this area, we are a leader. So we, I think, are bound to continue to that direction and make sure that we can build on this position of strength that we have. Another reason why Europe has been so well positioned in it is because Europe has come up with a legal framework, with the taxonomy. I hate the word, because there's the word tax in it. But it doesn't mean tax, I've been told, in the word taxonomy. It just means the framework. And we are the ones who have set the standards. Now, to tell you the truth, the OECD and others are now waking up and say, well, you cannot have that monopoly. Anyway, that was not the intention, but it's good to be the first one. We are the ones who inspire the others. So we are ahead of the others. And LGX is ahead of the others because it has built on that. Now, there are others who have developed lots of frameworks. I think of the one I'm wearing every day, the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17, that many of you wear here today. Well, obviously, our sustainability bond of Luxembourg also builds on these criteria, and those of ICMA, and many others to come. But Europe is a leader here. Let me also congratulate PACTA, who is with us here today, because we are using their methodology to do an X-ray of the portfolio of funds in Luxembourg, of the banks and insurances. It's a methodology that will help us have a better view what the reality is today in Luxembourg, spearheading, I think, what other countries will have to do in the future. Because, and that will be my final remark, sustainable finance has never been, and today cannot be seen as a nice thing to have. It is a must. We must finance green projects and green finance in order to achieve 2 things. To achieve the ambitious goal of 2050 of being carbon neutral, and the finance sector needs to finance that together with public sector, but the public sector can only come up with billions. What we need here is trillions. And that can only be done with a framework and with all the players of the financial center of Luxembourg and of the whole world to achieve that. And that's why we need the finance sector to green itself and ensure the transition of portfolios from non-sustainable assets to sustainable assets. That cannot happen in a minute or in a year. We need to make sure that this transition can happen step by step so that we can ensure financial stability. In one word, like in 1,000, I would just want to say, happy 5th anniversary. Thank you.
Thank you, Pierre Gramegna, for these insights and your ambitions for Luxembourg.
Thanks.